Hi guys, sorry for that. We had a small delay here, but are ready to get going. We know there were a couple of people already waiting, so we hope that everybody can hear us, can see us, and we will obviously share the slides as well for you guys very soon. So we're back after a couple of weeks now, going into the next topic on mobile speed optimization. And today we actually want to talk about preloading, prefetching, and in general setting priorities for the mobile web, because what we've been doing in the past is look a lot at the actual assets, how we can get them smaller, how can we optimize images, how can we defer loading of the JavaScript, or even, sneak out the last optimizations for CSS. And now we want to take a different angle and have a look, if we look at the pre-family, of what we can get out there in terms of optimization techniques. Seems like sound is working well. Thanks a lot for the confirmation from you guys from the other side. Yeah, and like always, we have Dominic here today with me, who is going to lead us through the topic, yeah, we're going to walk step by step through that. Feel free to shoot in questions as well. Also feel free to shoot in other questions if you have mobile speed related questions that are not 100% related. At least we got them in the chat then, and then we can make sure to address them either afterwards or in another Hackathon on Air session. So this whole meetups are really just about to get the whole community sort of sharing best practices and ideas around performance optimization, so that we can all decrease our speed indices.
And I'm sure there are some of our peers in the chat as well, and probably others that are listening. So just definitely shoot any questions you have, and either we pick them up during the live hangout, or someone else who's in the chat will pick it up, or we might even run an entire session about it.
Yeah, so, depends a little bit on the depth and breadth of the questions. And if we can't pick them up right now, we definitely make sure to address them at a future point in time. Cool. So yeah, due to the small delay, we're just gonna jump straight away into I think the topic for today. And as I said before, we want to talk about the pre-family and really see or have a second look on how using those different hints for the browser in order to get the right resources loaded at the right time, right? To really make sure that we sort of have a second thought about how the mobile sites in particular, which type of job they actually take on for the mobile user, and which resources in those particular jobs play, I'd say, the biggest role, and that we make sure that those resources are actually loading with a priority in comparison to other resources that might be less of importance in that particular scenario. So yeah, you already should, have seen our faces maybe a couple of times by now. So it's again Dominic and me, Lucas, and maybe I mentioned that already before, but from time to time we might get in some guests who will be joining into different topics. Today it's us looking into the pre-family. So just a small sort of introduction, because some people have been with us in a couple of sessions before. Some people, for some people, it's the first session. So we just want to make sure that you sort of get the background idea on why we're focusing so much on mobile speed and speed index in particular. And I'm gonna go into the details about this a little bit, a couple of minutes, and then we really go into more technical depth. So the idea that we sort of look into here in our team is that what we see is that there's too many indicators, basically from all the sides, from the user sides as well as from the clients that we're working with, that speed plays a very significant role. And the number one thing that really turns up into all the different research studies that we've been running in Google, also that third-party providers like SoaStar or others have been running, really show us that number one, waiting for a slow pages to load is one of the main annoyances users have, and one of the main decision drivers for abandon a site and choose another provider. You can see that by this particular study. I mean, there's many studies out there that support a very similar type of picture, really underlining the idea if you're able to render content fast to the user, you probably you are on a better path to keep those users, not lose them, because they might decide to go somewhere else if if your site is not loading, right, or if your content is not rendering. And again, one other study, I think this is a Google particular a study run by Google in particular, and this shows us that 53% of consumers will have it on the site if it takes longer than 3 seconds to load.
Yeah, I think just jumping in here, the study is actually it's anonymized Google Analytics data across all verticals and on a global scale. So 53% is what we see on average. It doesn't mean that like in your particular case, it will be 53%, but let it be even 20%, 25%. You really don't want to lose like every fourth visitor in the first 3 seconds. So it's sort of like a benchmark. It just means like the first 3 seconds are crucial. And that's why we're running the series to see like how can we actually optimize the critical rendering path.
Yeah. And I mean, this is with all of those studies, right? They are usually with many of the ones that we're working with, they're not necessarily vertical specific. It gives more an idea or transfers more a concept that right now in the situations, if we give the user a blank screen for quite a while, they might just be leaving, and we just paid for them to come. So that's what we want to avoid. And that's why we look at those early rendering or techniques in order to get to our render quicker from all the different angles. And today it's looking from the pre-family angle. Okay, and yeah, I mean, without spending too much time on generic data, because obviously we sort of have the idea already in mind, most of us at least, but just like very quickly highlighting here this study from Soasta, which looks into full load time on the x-axis. So we can see that we jump in 300 millisecond steps. And the colors are not super clear on here, but you see the top line, the pinkish one that has the second spike with the conversion rate at 1.9 is around 2.4 seconds at its sort of optimal state. And from there on just keeps on declining with the more or the longer it takes to load the site. I often get asked if this is full load time or any other particular metric. So we're talking about full load time here, but nevertheless, if we think about the time that it takes to render, and that should definitely be shorter than ideally, right? Or be at least in that area. So if we are able to render a full first screen with the key hero image, the key messages, and the key call to actions, ideally to the user, at least after in shorter time than 5 seconds, we definitely are starting to make use of what performance can actually give us in terms of conversion rate optimization or even a decrease in bounce rate. And that's why we take this particular focus on loading those assets quickly. The metric, just to round up the background story before we get into more specifications about the pre-family, is the metric that we look in particular is called speed index. We have been mentioning that a couple of times, just for the ones who are new. So please bear with me if you have heard me talking about speed index already a couple of times. But speed index is basically a metric that gives us the time that it takes in milliseconds. So we have here as an example 2,309 milliseconds for the Amazon side. The time that it takes to get to the first full render of the above the fold content or the first screen. And the idea here is really just to say, okay, how long does it take until we can tell something meaningful to the user? And if this time takes longer and longer, we see sometimes sites with like speed indexes, I don't know, some 12,000, 14,000, 18,000, and even higher than that, which means basically after about 12 seconds, 14 seconds, or 18 seconds, the user just starts getting to see meaningful content. And that's pretty late, especially given the sensitivity that we have seen just in the studies before, where ideally we push out our content below 5 seconds. Yeah, and with this back in the back of our minds, we want to sort of now start to look into the pre-family and sort of the whole different techniques that can be applied there for there are various different situations. And you might ask yourself, the pre-what family? So basically, there is a lot of different things we can do on this whole path along the DNS lookup. the TLS negotiation, HTTP request, and then in the end actually getting the content to be downloaded. So there's small tips and techniques that you could apply in the different stages of this process in order to prioritize the right content. And we basically want to move through them step by step, give you an overview of in which scenarios this might be helpful, or in which sort of setup that might be the choice for you to go, and also talk a little bit about the sort of cross-browser compatibility of the different techniques, and with that sort of probably helping you a little bit to make the decision, or at least giving you a sort of a guideline to how you could make that decision in order to get the right resources prioritized. And also with that sort of, all sort of reflecting back into how can we render quicker? How can we make sure we don't block critical rendering paths too long with then having a quick render? Anything to add from your side at this point?
No, I mean, you pretty much summed it up. We just run through it step by step and just look at the, the different options that we have and actually when to use it. And so, yeah, no, from my side, we should just get started.
Great, cool. So just what would be maybe some nice to knows. Probably most of you are aware already, but basically you can find the Chrome basically already by default will resolve the top 10 destinations based on your sort of user behavior or browsing behavior. So just on browser startup, just giving you that as the background information that you like from a Chrome side, for example. There's also a lot of thinking around what resources to prepare before the user actually gets starting. And this is one sort of indicator for this. And why not taking this type of thinking and applying this to the websites that we want to get loaded fast for the user. And you can actually, I didn't mention, you can actually just check that very quickly for yourself, which are the ones that are already pre-resolved for you with Chrome and then DNS, as you see there in the blue box on the right side. Another way on how sort of this thinking is applied even within Chrome is to think about, okay, what sites should be, for example, be fully pre-rendered in the background. And so what you can see here is on the right side, sort of like a confidence calculation based on what the user is typing. In this scenario, he's starting to type AMA, and with a relatively high confidence, we can see then, okay, Amazon is going to be the one resource or the one site that's going to be requested. And the browser from there on takes its next steps and sort of through this confidence rating is able to predict in a way what the user is going to be using, and therefore already pre-renders content at this point in time.
Yeah, I guess just to add here is that it doesn't pre-render it all the time. So there's the browser might pre-render it. So it's, there's a lot of calculations going on, a lot of testing going on. But basically the idea behind it is that, the browser wants to be kind of like a step ahead of you and think like, okay, what is the user doing now? And then in certain situations where it makes the most sense, the browser might pre-render the page so that you have an even quicker experience. But again, that doesn't happen all the time. And I think that's just important to add. So let's just move forward. Basically, the whole idea is so we kind of showed you that the browser's already doing a lot of things like pre-resolving DNS, possibly pre-rendering pages or sites. And the idea is now that basically the browser knows a lot already, but in the end, your website and your users best. You might do A and B testing. You actually have the data. You look into the data. You analyze the data. So basically, you can figure the best what the user is doing next. A lot of people don't do that, but I think it's really important to do that, because when you know what the user is doing next, you can actually be smart and load the resources that the user will request, in the following steps. So basically, the idea is with the whole pre-family to basically help the browser anticipate the next step, help the browser be smarter and help the browser do the right things rather than, load resources that maybe you don't know. So to bring it into the real world, it's sort of like, you don't want to put a lot of food on the table just because, the people at the table might eat it. That's the waste. Like, you actually just want to put on the table what people are going to eat. You don't want to throw food in the trash. And that's the whole idea in the web as well. You don't want to load a lot of resources that the user might actually not need. You actually want to focus on, okay, that's the resource the user needs. That's the resource the user will need in the next step. And then you preload the resources. You already put it in cache to create the best browsing experience possible. And that's how we basically get into like the whole pre-family. So like the first step would be DNS Prefetch. What does it do? So DNS Prefetch basically translates the domain name into an IP address. And there are many cases where that's useful because that resource is requested from this host name. So you might just say like, okay, I'll just prefetch it right now, so that when the user actually is requesting the resource, I don't have to do that anymore, and I save a little bit of time. Usually, you would use that for critical resources that you need later in the page. There might be the situation where a resource is behind a redirect. So like you request a resource, but then there's a 301 redirect, and you actually need to resolve this domain name as well. So that's where it could be useful as well. Another option would be basically for outgoing links. So if we just hop on the next slide, we basically see an example of that. So at Google, for example, you type in a search query, DNS Prefetch, for example, we list you the results, and what we do is basically we pre-resolve the domain names in the search results, so that if you actually click on one of the links to go to the next page or the next site, you have a faster experience. So there are like quite useful situations where you can use that. The good thing about it is you only focus on the DNS resolution, which means that it's not very heavy for the bandwidth. So you can actually do that for a lot of host names. However, always think about, always like kind of like calculate the real world impact, like that it has on your load times, and ideally make sure that you don't load as too many resources from different domain names, because it's a good thing to use, but ideally you just want to resolve one or two host names, so you don't actually get into the situation where you have to do like DNS prefetch everywhere. But that's basically the starting point where you can kind of like predict what resource the user is going to use next, and if you actually need to optimize a little bit in terms of DNS prefetching.
Yeah. And as I said before, we're going to basically, for all the different techniques, we're going to show you just here. I mean, basically, if you go to Can I Use, you can basically check that also yourself to see for the different hints that you can give to the browser in regards to its compatibility across the different browsers. And obviously, given that we're talking about the mobile web, having a particular look there on the right side, iOS, Safari, Android browser, and Chrome for Android, to make sure that we can actually make use of this on the mobile device. And it looks pretty good for DNS Prefetch at the very moment. Anything you want to add at the very moment, Tom?
No, I think that's basically it. We got one question here in the chat: how many DNS prefetches should be max on the site? It's always a difficult one. Best answer is as little as possible. Obviously, you don't want to basically use the bandwidth for resolving too many domain names. So ideally optimize your resources that you host them ideally on your own server, or maybe just like have one CDN. Just make sure that that you optimize where you get the resources from, and don't actually get into this situation where you have to like prefetch like a whole bunch of domain names. Yeah, and then we basically come to the sort of like the next step. So like when you think DNS prefetch is cool, then like preconnect is is really cool, because what preconnect does, it doesn't only pre-resolves the DNS, but it also, basically does the whole, the whole connection. So like it basically does the socket connect and also like the TLS negotiation, if that's the case on your side. And one good example here would be when you load a web font, for example, from the Google server. You see it in basically the first, so we got like two waterfalls, the top one and the bottom one. And what you see in the top one is that we load the CSS for the font, because whenever you load a web font, you first need the CSS, and then the CSS tells the browser, okay, and now I need that particular font font file to then basically render the text in that font. So what you see here is like up until roughly 1.8 seconds, you download the CSS, and then you start connecting to the fonts.gstatic.com domain, which is where you get the font file from. As you can see in the first one, at roughly 1.8 seconds, that's when you start connecting to the gstatic.com domain. And in the second waterfall, we actually use preconnect. And what you see is that here we already connect to the socket while we are connecting to googleapis.com and basically get the CSS. So we're basically saving a whole bunch of time here just by smartly, pre-connecting to the server that we will use next. And the reason why it works really well with web fonts is because, if you load the CSS of web font, you're pretty sure that you will need that font file. So like that's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Kind of like think smartly about the next steps. In this case, this step makes a whole lot of sense. So yeah, that's basically a really great example of how preconnect could work and save you time. In this case, I think we're saving about like 0.2 seconds. When you remember like the stats that we looked at earlier, every millisecond counts. So like this is a really good way to optimize the rendering of your web fonts.
And what would you say next to web fonts? Is there other file formats that this works really well with, you think?
I mean, it does work well to file formats. Again, it's it is a little bit more resource heavy than just a DNS resolution. So you don't want to pre-connect to a whole bunch of sockets that maybe in the end you don't need. So kind of like you want to say pre-connect often, but to definitely do it wisely. You got to be sure that if you pre-connect to a socket, you actually will need a resource from that server. Otherwise, it's a waste for your bandwidth. You're taking up space for maybe what you could use for other resources to be rendered. So again, use it often, but use it wisely. In the source, there's a link to a blog post from our colleague Ilya, basically giving that example again and like summing it up and talking about a couple other things. So like definitely go to the blog post, read a bit more about it. It's definitely worth it. However, one thing to mention is that when we go on the next slide, you gotta make sure that you use the cross-origin attribute here, because otherwise what happens, like you see the left waterfall and the right waterfall, which basically in the left waterfall, we didn't use it. We didn't use cross-origin. And what happens is you only do the DNS lookup. So you're not actually doing like you're not doing the full thing. And then like if you use a cross-origin, you actually do the TCP and TLS negotiation as well. Reason for that is, quote below, font face specification requires that fonts are loaded in anonymous mode, which is why we have to add cross-origin. So just make sure that you use it that way, and so you don't run into any issues where like you use preconnect and in the end you actually don't get the benefit as hoped.
Yeah, and just to always keep in the back of your mind is to always reflect back, why are we doing this? Obviously, the goal will always be to make sure that we get the content out quickly to the user, right? So that if we can make it happen that our fonts get displayed faster because we don't have to wait, for example, for the whole lookup while we're doing it already, while other resources are loading, we will be a little bit quicker to actually get our fonts out and running, because we have seen numerous times that, for example, the site starts to render, but we're still waiting for for content to appear, and all of this plays into it, right? So now we're really approaching it from this particular angle. Great. So in terms of compatibility, it's a slightly bit lower than we had with the DNS Prefetch, but still very widely applicable. And you see Android browser, Chrome for Android works fine there. So yeah, if you want to go that route, there's definitely some solid compatibility happening.
Yeah, and I think like just the one thing to always mention that you can safely use, for example, preconnect, and even if the browser does not support it, you're not breaking anything. It will just be treated as if the if preconnect, if the attribute wasn't there. So don't worry about using it, even if maybe a few browsers don't support it. Definitely safe to do it. So I think that's just always good to mention here. Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, there was one more thing we wanted to talk about in terms of pre-connecting. So I think it's quite important to say that basically the pre-connect directive is an optimization hint, which basically means that we hint to the browser, that the browser should pre-connect to the server. However, the browser might not act on that like each and every time, because basically, the browser is also like, browser is quite smart and doing a lot of like calculations in the background. It's always a trade-off. Obviously, if you pre-connect, it's it might not always be the best for speed. So like the browser is doing a lot of work trying to figure out when it's best to actually pre-connect. So there might be the situation that you use pre-connect, but in the end you only do the DNS lookup, or you might only do the DNS and TCP for TLS connections. Sorry, there's a typo. It should not read DMS, but DNS. So that's just important to mention for debugging. So like if you use preconnect and it doesn't work, it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. So don't spend like an hour trying to fix it. It's just like then probably in this case the browser identified that in this particular case it's maybe not the best moment to do the full connection. So that just as a hint, so you don't waste your time on fixing something that's not broken. Yeah, and then like basically we get to the next pretty cool feature, which is preload. That's very useful for high priority resources. And basically what it does is you use it in the head to initiate the immediate fetch for the current page. And especially use it for high priority resources. And all you do is basically, as in the example, you add preload, and the browsers that support it will basically asynchronously fetch a resource. So like it's not render blocking anymore, and then make it available when you actually need it. So if we hop on the next slide, I just did a little example there, which there's more information on that when you follow the link in the footer. So basically, you add preload, and what it does is like it fetches the CSS. Then you see you can add you should add the onload attribute, which basically makes sure that the fetch CSS is also applied. The great thing here is that basically you're loading the style sheet, and as you know, CSS and JavaScript, as it has the potential or the power to change the document object model, it is typically render blocking. So nothing happens on the screen until the resources are fetched and parsed. And we try, we want to avoid that, especially when we have CSS that we might need later on the page, but not for the critical rendering path, as in like for the first paint. So here you fetch a CSS, you apply the CSS, onload, and the good thing is that it requires JavaScript, and we can just use a fallback, which means like that if for whatever reason JavaScript is disabled, you just add the no-script tag and you just load the style sheet as you would normally. So that's kind of like the fallback, that you don't break anything. However, right now preload is, in terms of like cross-browser compatibility, it's not that great. It's relatively new. So that's why we're linking to this small JavaScript function, load CSS, which is basically polyfill, and you would use it as shown in the last screenshot. So basically, you use preload, and what the load CSS function does is like it checks if the browser supports it. If the browser supports it, the load CSS function does nothing. So, the browser just uses preload and does what I just explained. However, if for whatever reason the browser does not support preload, then the load CSS polyfill jumps in and performs the same action. So that's a pretty cool thing to do. Again, like it works really well with CSS that you might use on the page, like somewhere below the fold, but not in the critical view, so that you kind of like split it up a little bit and avoid having like one global CSS file or one big CSS file that takes 2 seconds to load on a 3G connection, and you're basically just blocking the rendering path in the end for nothing, because all the stuff that you load you actually don't use until like much further down the line. So yeah, that's a really good way to do it. I think on the next slide we actually show you the cross-browser compatibility, which yeah, Lucas, it's not looking that great.
Yeah, you see that here on Android browser, Chrome for Android, we are able to support this. But I mean, there's a lot of red boxes out there. But I mean, Dom just explained how you can obviously deal with that. But I mean, some support there. I hope it's going to increase over time. Yes, so that other browsers can catch up there. Great. Just prefetch.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, I mean, basically that's another option, like another part of the pre family. So what is prefetch? It's basically useful for low priority resources. So what we discussed with preload is that we actually load CSS asynchronously and then apply it basically on load. So like we avoid the render block, but we still need that CSS for that current page to make sure that it's displayed correctly. Prefetch does it a little bit different. So like prefetch, basically what it does is it lets you fetch CSS, which is like a deferred fetch, and put it in the browser cache for later navigation. So one good example would be that we work with a lot of clients, and one best practice is to actually extract the critical CSS and only load that CSS on the landing page and make sure that everything renders as quick as possible. Then we often get the question, well, yeah, but what happens then if the user navigates further in the funnel, because basically I just defer the slow load time further down the line. And that's where prefetch comes in, because basically what it lets you do is you have the critical CSS, you do like a really quick rendering, and then you can basically defer the fetch of the additional CSS that you might use on subsequent pages and just put it in the browser cache, so that if the user continues in the funnel, you don't have this delay on the second or third page, but you actually have the CSS already in cache. So again, it's it fetches the assets and places them in the cache. It's useful for non-critical resources for later navigation, and what's important is lowest possible priority. So like again, if you're talking about a file that's sort of critical, then prefetch is not what you want to use, because it's the lowest possible priority. However, if for example you're on the shopping cart page and you say like, okay, I'm pretty sure the user will now navigate to the checkout, you might want to say, okay, I'll prefetch already a few resources, put them in cache, so that actually create like a really good and fast experience.
Yeah, and now we basically move from this idea of just optimizing speed index sort of as a first destination where the user comes to from optimizing this, to actually then start taking care of the whole funnel that the user is going through. So sort of like playing with all of these variables in the end, then will end up in at least in most optimized solution that you could achieve. And then prefetch helps you to think about that second step, like what's happening with the next step where the user is going.
Yeah, let's just have a look at the cross-browser compatibility.
That's pretty good to me. So, so as I said, many browsers support it. On mobile, looks pretty good. On Android Chrome for Android as well. iOS not so good at the very moment. Let's see. But yeah, I think actually from all of the things that we do is the most supported option as far as I remember. So you can use that with confidence, I would say.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, let's basically get to the last family member of the pre-family, which is pre-render. If you actually, if you think about AMP, it's sort of like the idea, like pages are pre-rendered, are cached, and when I access an AMP page, it's in a split second, it's there. I think the average load time of an AMP page is 0.9 seconds. So the idea is the same. Basically, we pre-render an entire page with all its resources because we believe that the user will go on that page next. So pre-rendering is cool, but it can also be very dangerous because it is very, very resource heavy. Again, you're rendering an entire page with all its assets, and therefore it causes high bandwidth costs, and especially on a mobile device. On a mobile device, if you think about that, we often connect via a 3G connection. We have a limited bandwidth, average maybe 1.6 megabyte per second. So you really don't want to pre-render an entire page with all its assets if you're not 100% sure. Well, maybe, not maybe 100%, that would be nice. But if you're not very, very certain that the user will move to that next, to that page next. So again, use it with care. It's very hard to think about a use case where it would always work. It probably doesn't exist. So you really need to analyze your data, analyze your users, the kind of like the user flow to get an idea, what do users typically do, and is there maybe a situation where the pre-rendering of an entire page can make sense. What's important here is to mention is that obviously what you want to avoid is that you sort of mess up your analytics by pre-rendering a page, because it might happen that a user is on the let's say on a previous page, pre-renders the next page, never visits the next page, but then your analytics beacons kind of like track it as a visit, and you think you kind of like get wrong stats. So you want to avoid that. Good thing is you can do that with the page visibility API. So it basically lets you do it basically lets you defer JavaScript actions until the page is actually visible. Again, useful for analytics beacons, tracking pixels, custom JS code. Good thing to note is that Google Analytics does this automatically, so you actually don't need to worry about that anymore if you want to use pre-rendering. Again, I think out of the whole pre-family, pre-rendering is probably the one that you want to be most careful with, because it is very resource heavy, and it might not actually have a good impact in terms of speed and optimization. So, always be wary, but when you use it. But I think it's definitely worth it to just do a bit of testing and see how it can fit into your overall strategy.
I think it's also one of the least supported options that we have out there. So you can see that here pretty well. So even Android browser not fully supports it yet. So a couple of them do. So sort of more as a side note, I would say, to note the idea of pre-rendering.
Yeah, and I think that was the quick summary of the pre-family. I think we pretty much touched the most important points here. Again, they all have their their usability in certain situations, whether it's DNS prefetching, preconnecting, pre-rendering, prefetching. So do a bit more reading. Again, we have, I think, 2 or 3 sources on the slides with great information about the pre-family. So do a bit more reading and just see how it can actually fit into your strategy. I think, to summarize, what we really want to achieve is that you as a website owner think a little bit more like your user. Try and understand your user, try and anticipate the next steps. If you go somewhere, if you go through a forest and you actually have you kind of have a map and you know exactly where you're going, you will always reach your goal quicker than when you're trying to figure it out along the way. And that's sort of the idea behind it. Try to be kind of informed about what the user typically requests, what page the user typically visits next, and then be smart and preload resources, put resources in cache, that you not only optimize the page speed index, which you will, but you also optimize the whole funnel and therefore like the whole experience. And yeah, I guess like in the web, and especially the mobile web, where the competition is just one click away, it's just really important to do that. And that might give you the edge over your competition and increase your conversion rate, and therefore like give you a higher return on investment. So we will go through some of the questions in the chat later on, and then we will decide whether we run another maybe another session on them. I think there was one question earlier on talking about what framework we prefer, Bootstrap or Foundation, and which is cool to see is that like another person in the chat actually said, in my opinion, no one should use a Bootstrap nowadays anymore, especially when we have CSS Grid. So basically the idea here is, frameworks are great because it's an easy way of achieving cross-browser compatibility and developing websites. But always keep in mind that you're loading a lot of CSS, in some cases a lot of JavaScript that you might not use for your particular website, because a framework is there to accommodate a vast, like a vast collection of websites. It wants to be useful for a lead generation side. It wants to be useful for an e-commerce shop. So obviously there's a lot of CSS and JavaScript involved that you might not use on your website. And so from a performance perspective, always be very, very careful when using a framework.
Cool. Yeah, and if you wanted the resources, we will just put them also below in the comments. So if you watch this video afterwards, just scroll down and have a look, or check back in a couple of minutes after the session. We will put all the links up so that you have access to them with no further hassle. And yeah, so we keep on running those sessions regularly. We will probably start putting also the topics out there, so for you guys to review sort of pre the session, so that you can sort of get an overview of what will be the upcoming sessions, but we will keep you posted on that. And always feel free to throw in questions into the comments or the chat, and so that we can sort of guide the learning together and figure out what are the key issues to look at. Yeah, so that was it for today. Just one sort of pointer in regards to the pre-family. Hope you can make use of it. Seems in many ways to be implemented relatively quickly, actually, in comparison to some other things that we've been looking at. So thanks a lot for taking the time. Been a bit quicker than we were thinking, but okay. And we just see you next time, I think.
Thanks for listening. And again, put all your questions in the comments. We will add the resource links there, and the whole idea in the future is to kind of like build a huge repository of videos on particular optimization techniques, and we're always eager to learn from you. So I think what's really important to mention as well is, if you actually decide to use DNS prefetching, to use prefetching, to use preconnecting, and you experience either like a good impact or a negative impact on your performance, let us know. We're really happy to learn and to see what works, what doesn't work, why doesn't it work. So the more information you share with us, the better we can respond to it. So definitely feel free to reach out to us with any feedback you have. And yeah, thanks for listening, and see you next month.
Yeah, have a great week, guys. Take care. Bye.
Bye.